Hi, I'm Manny, and I'm here to break the silence.
Content warning. This video contains sensitive discussions about prejudice, discrimination, and racism.
Racism, I always define as prejudice plus power. But it's one thing to not like someone because of how they look and how you were brought up to think about how they look. But it's a totally different thing to be in the position because you don't like them to impose certain things upon them. Racism is much deeper than prejudice.
Hi, I'm Roman Davis, and I'm here with the Break the Silence event for you. I'm sitting here with Manny. And Manny, why did you decide to break the silence today?
Man, the more I think about it, the more I think that there are people who don't have the opportunity to have their voice represented and to have their experiences talked about. And so when this opportunity arose, I was like, man, it's just gotta share.
All right, well, tell us a little bit more about your voice. Let's hear your story today.
Sure, man. Well, first off, thank you for having me, man.
Mm-hmm.
I'm honored to be here and awfully grateful that the Y is taking this seriously and desires to do this. I grew up in Mattapan, Massachusetts, back when it was Murderpan, in this small, tight-knit Caribbean community. We lived in this apartment building, 12 apartments, and we just knew everybody. Everyone, we could be disciplined by anyone. We could hang out with anyone. That was what we knew as community. And there was safety, there was comfortability, there was protection in that. And then we moved from Mattapan to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, into a all-white working class community, which was very, 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 very different than anything that I had ever experienced or could even fathom at the time. And differences were not just felt immediately, but they were kind of acknowledged immediately. We moved in, and then the following week, there was a white family who up and left our street. Wow. You know, white flight commenced immediately. It was almost this idea that the minute, a black family comes into the area, oh my gosh, property values gotta go down.
Yeah.
Get time to go. But that was mild, in comparison to some of the other things that we experienced. I was going in the 5th grade, I think, and just getting ready for middle school.
Manny, not to interrupt you, but tell us the time frame. What years were this?
Okay.
90s, 2000s?
Yeah, so this was late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
Late 80s, early 90s, going into middle school. And what I remember most was there were kids who wanted to be nice. And then there were kids who certainly just looked at us as, who in the world are y'all, And what we recognized pretty quickly was that it wasn't just that we were different in terms of our racial demographic and our, kind of socioeconomic demographic. We were different just across the board to some people. One of the things that I remember, we grew up in this apartment building, like I told you, and in that setting, we were poor, right? So there were rodents, there were mice, there were roaches, and I remember a kid from the neighborhood in Pawtucket coming to the house like, oh, what is that? And I was like, it's a roach. What's the matter with you for you not having roaches? This is what, we're accustomed to. And it was sad that that then became maybe a sticking point, like, oh, I don't know about them, right? And those were some of the things that made me recognize pretty soon, pretty early on, that we were different. I remember being bullied by a kid. This particular kid, we were poor, we were black, And we were in this community. Folks weren't rich in this community, but they weren't poor, they weren't black, right? And, we didn't have the best of clothing. School shopping for me as a kid was at the Goodwill store, or whatever, Salvation Army, whatever, right? And so I'd go to school and these kids would come to school and we'd not just look different physiologically, we'd look different in terms of our appearance, our clothing, all of that. And it just made for us feeling pretty early on that they were better, we were less than. On top of that, my dad drove a cab, and everyone else's parent, father, whatever, was doing something. They weren't driving no taxi cab, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was this almost shame associated with the different in socioeconomic status and race.
Almost like a stigma, right?
Yeah. It's almost like, man, what are you doing here? And not only what are you doing here, why? Like, you don't belong.
Describe to us how it feels to know that your dad works as hard as he does.
Yep.
And he is driving that cab around. So you have that negative stigma, not only follow him, but the entire family of someone that's just trying to provide for his family.
Right. So honestly, growing up, I didn't necessarily think about it broadly, right? I just thought about it as, hey, you gotta do what you gotta do, and it is what it is, right? And on a number of occasions, I had kids come like, your dad drives a cab? That's weird, right? And I was like, hey, it just is what it is. And sometimes I'd say, well, he owns his own company, right? I try to kind of flip the script, knowing full well that internally I was like, man, I don't know why he drives a cab, right? And truth is, him driving his cab all the hours he drove his cab is what helped us get out of prepared to Pawtucket, right? And so, nonetheless, the journey in terms of just kind of figuring out both identity and place of fit, I feel we had this underlying message that we just carried, right? When I went from middle school to high school, there was a little bit more diversity, right?
And what was diversity to you? That's a good question, right? So when you say a little bit more diversity, does that mean you saw more people look like yourself? Or was that you saw different colors of, all the people different colors?
Yeah.
What was that to you?
So I don't know what the percentage was, but there was a little bit more. Like we met some folks who are Cape Verdean, in high school and maybe even middle school. My guess is it was still, under 10%, probably closer to 5%, but it was still more than what middle school was, And so I was like, oh, okay. And, naturally those ended up being places of, just kind of connection and affinity just because of common experience, right? And comfortability. But fast forward past high school, I think this was when I really began to get a sense of, man. It's almost as if society reaffirms and instills this message of separate, not equal. Not separate, but equal. Separate, unequal, really is a better way to put it. I was in college class, and it was really there that I began to kind of see just how subtle but incredibly pervasive this notion of white privilege is within our historical cultural context. I remember being in class, I don't remember kind of what actually triggered this, but I just remember really my reaction. I don't remember the content of the course or whatever, but I just remember feeling almost like experiencing an awakening. Like, oh my gosh, like the society dictates what's beautiful, what's acceptable, right? Like the reason I like or had a preference at that time for lighter skinned women and straighter haired women is because that's whiter, right? And I didn't understand that that wasn't me, right? Rather, that was a societal norm that was imposed upon me. And it was almost like, whoa, am I perpetuating this narrative? Or am I actually going to really recognize the beauty of my history and my experiences? In a lot of ways, that's why it's so important to have conversations like these, Roman.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because there's so many folks who, without knowing, perpetuate and push forth this separate and unequal narrative, line.
Absolutely.
And until our community can really begin to see this for what it really is, this will continue on.
Well, that's what I mean. You bring up a good example there. How do we make them see this?
Yeah.
How do we have them say, this is not okay for people to feel this way, to be treated this way? And for myself, you know, as speaking for them, how do they then do something about it?
Right.
When they see a Manny and when they see a Roman, you know, how can they put themselves in our shoes?
So I certainly think it's why conversations like these matter, right? I do think there are a lot of well-intentioned folks who simply don't know because they really haven't listened to the experience of someone who might be of a different race, in a different kind of, you know, ethnic background, right? Because sometimes it's one thing to say, okay, I'm of African-American descent, but there's a different experience of someone who is of Afro-Caribbean descent. There's a different experience across the board. So I think there has to be the promotion of this openness and dialogue that really does honor the beauty of our differences.
It's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, the diversity that we bring makes us stronger, but only if we actually view it as such. It's a matter of perspective that I don't think folks always have, right? But how do you do that? There has to be intentionality, right? Speaking for, you know, just my white friends, right? Those whom I'm in closest relationship are folks who've actually taken the time to say, hey, tell me a little bit more about what your experiences have been. You know, folks who've actually taken an interest in getting to know me more deeply for me in my entirety versus just what I bring, you know, in whatever the setting is. So this goes back to relationship. This goes back to continuing to have these dialogues. And then ultimately this has to go back to standing for justice, standing for what's right. Like, I know this isn't, you know, a political conversation, but, you know, we've got to see injustice and speak against it.
Call it out. Call it out for what it is.
Absolutely. We've got to be able to see those who are treated wrongly and be like, hey, you know, why is that? And let's stand with them so that things can go forward. I can kind of leave it as such, but there's so many opportunities, I feel, for people to really stand and be a part of this. And it's just in being really relatable and having, you know, real, earnest conversation with folks. Not the surface stuff, but go a little bit deeper. Ask about what your experience has been like. Ask about what was discrimination like for you. Ask about, so why does this resonate with you? You know, after George Floyd was murdered, I got a phone call from a friend in California. His brother called me up and he was like, Manny, this is so different. Why is this so different, right? And I was so grateful for that phone call because it gave me an opportunity to share at a deeper level than what I've really had opportunity to share with them before.
I'm right with you. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, as a result of that, we grew deeper.
Yeah.
We grew deeper. And I think folks are almost scared of touching this. They'll say, oh, that's just terrible. And missing the opportunity to actually grow in deeper connection and come to a place of deepened understanding so that there can be support going forward.
Well, I think you bring up a good point. I think the person has to be extremely open to that conversation, but also knock down their walls. There's a lot of barriers that people put into place because once you open up that can of worms, as sort of say, there's almost this defensiveness that comes up. Well, well, that's not what I do.
Right.
It's like, well, I'm not talking about what you do. I'm talking about my experience and how I've lived through this world. And I think sometimes when you have these open conversations, there's this automatic almost finger pointing. And it's not finger pointing. It's really sharing people's experiences about how they live everyday life. And I think you brought up something really, really prominent that we don't discuss enough, and is that the culture that we have grown up in and the culture that we live in is predominantly in one view. And that view is in power, and that view is something that we have had struggle with our entire lives. So now that we're peeling back this onion and peeling back this curtain and showing people, no, this actually has really affected my life in a negative way. And because I've been able to get through this, yes, I am this person now as a career and all this stuff, and you can ask me all these questions, but in that moment, no one cared. And in that moment, no one asked me how I felt. And I had to take that home with me and deal with it by myself. And so, to bring up the George Floyd situation, what I thought was a little bit sad was that people are using this moment as a way to almost knock down the defensiveness, but at the same time continue that defensiveness. And I thought it's a really good point that you brought up, that your friend in Cali called you after it happened, which I think a lot of people of color have experienced. People just out of the woodwork calling each other, right? Just saying, how do you feel about this? And when I said this, did that mean something to you? And so I like that you brought up that conversation, because that, again, is talking at a deeper level than more than we ever really go into. And we're not getting political here, but you're here to break the silence. You're here to talk about what you want to talk about. So I don't want ever you to think that, us bringing up a political conversation isn't okay. And I think a lot of our viewers right now are going to be going through that same experience and trying to resonate and how to help. I shouldn't even say help, because that is a strong word, but how to connect and resonate with people like us. You know what I mean? So talk to us a little bit more about your adult life. So as you said, you went to college, you had these experiences in college, you really realized that white, privilege is pervasive, and it's what we go through every day. But how did you take that into your adult life after college?
It's so interesting because, Roman, you said something kind of reflecting upon what I had shared, this idea of power, right? And racism, I always define as prejudice plus power. And that's one of the things that some of my white friends just really don't quite get initially, because they view racism as just prejudice, prejudice based on race. But it's one thing to not like someone because of how they look and how you were brought up to think about how they look, right? But it's a totally different thing to be in the position, because you don't like them, to impose certain things upon them, right? And then that begins to help folks understand a little bit about how racism is much deeper than prejudice, right? And so when I think about this whole idea of power kind of growing into just adulthood, what I've often just grappled with is the deep-seated racism throughout our nation and the effects that it's had upon folks, everything from incarceration rates, and this crazy new Jim Crow with drug laws, imprisoning and landing folks unjustly in jail at alarming rates. People of color in particular is what I'm talking about there. And then all of the ripple effects that that's had, right? So coming out, growing into adulthood, I've just had this just awareness of how crazy our society is, broken our society is, and how much we need as a whole to see this system uprooted. You know, I think about just the history of it for me. The history of it, there's a book that really just spoke volumes to this for me. It's a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. I'm not sure you're familiar with it.
I've heard of it, yeah.
But in this book, what she does is she kind of unpacks how the history, how let's get tough on drugs, and how we've got historical evidence that American government flooded certain inner cities with drugs so that they could again get tough on drugs and all sorts of mess, right? I don't even want to get into all of it. But what's it speak to? It really speaks to this racist historical narrative that we come out of, and how folks for generations have, while they might not be enslaved, right? But to some extent, they are.
We talk about
Right.
the slave mentality,
Oh, man.
you know,
brother.
and that is
Oh, man.
probably a conversation for another day, because we can probably spend a long time on that. But they talk about that a
could.
lot, and connection,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And so here we are, where Black men in America trying to raise families, right? I have a 15-year-old son, Roman. One day my son calls me. He's at a bus station, and a cop rolls up to the bus station, and he's sitting there, he's waiting, and it's late. There's no one else there. Cop rolls up to him and says, "Hey, boy." He freezes because he knows he's a Black man in America, right? And it don't matter that he's 15 years old, right? He's a Black man in America. It don't matter that he's 12 years old. He is a Black man in America. So my son don't even feel empowered to put his head up. My son keeps his head down and fronts like he can't hear, because he don't want to give no cop any excuse to accost him, to interrogate him. It's not like he got nothing on him, right? But it don't matter.
Doesn't.
It don't matter. And what my hope is that folks understand that that's how we live, right? That's how we live. And we live this way in 2020 still, because we haven't, as a whole, really come together enough to do whatever it takes to kind of begin to eradicate this.
Well, I think what's so powerful about that is that I think your son's story, unfortunately, is every young Black man's story in America, and how we have been conditioned to grow up by whether our parents have had the conversation with us, or we have unfortunately run into law enforcement that hasn't been so kind, to say the least.
Right.
So we're running out of time today, and I'm going to invite you back to our second series because I can't wait to have you back. But my last question I have for you today is really, what do you want us and the viewer to get out of our conversation today, and you breaking the silence today?
Man, it's my hope that everyone here, everyone watching, really hears an experience that is one of millions across our land, right? And understand and know that the only way that we move forward is when folks actually take the time to listen, and then take the time to come together and act so that injustice, racial injustice, could be eradicated.
Well, I think that is a perfect way to wrap up this conversation today, Manny. I cannot thank you enough for sharing today and spending the time with us and volunteering your story. Thank you.
Man, my pleasure, man. And thank you.
Of course.
Till we do this again.
Till next time.